Roswell, of course, has become a case which everyone considers to be the defining case, if you will, of contemporary ufology. And of course, because of the fact that it offers the opportunity or the prospect of actual physical evidence and proof of visitation, everyone is very excited about it and has been for many years. And so was I. That's how I got into it. When I first took a look at the case, when I first read Kevin Randle's and Don Schmidt's book, A UFO Crash at Roswell, having earlier read the Roswell incident, which didn't impress me terribly much, I thought, gee, there's been some very serious work done here that suggests that there's something more to this incident than a weather balloon. And so I got involved. And I had hoped that, in fact, my work would supplement, reinforce, help further prove the case that was being made by other researchers. I discovered, unfortunately, that it was quite the opposite. What I discovered was that there was a lot less to Roswell than meets the eye. That most of the case that makes Roswell the incident interesting is not a case at all. It's a combination of hype and wishful thinking and fraudulent testimony and expectations being, if you will, self-fulfilled. And so what I discovered was that Roswell indeed was a real incident. Something very real happened. Something real was recovered. There was really a cover-up. But what was being covered up was not the crash and recovery of an alien spacecraft and the bodies of its crew, but rather a highly sensitive, highly classified project of the United States government. And I spent a good 8 years digging into this case in excruciating detail. And I have laid out in my book, Roswell, Inconvenient Facts and the Will to Believe, this whole odyssey, if you will, as well as all the data and evidence that back up my conclusions. Roswell is replete with people who, at first blush, seem to have very interesting information and seem to have been very much involved in an important way. And then when you start digging into it, you discover things that demonstrate quite a different picture. One of these is Glenn Dennis. Glenn Dennis was, at the time of the incident, a newly minted embalmer working at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. And he claims to have been told by a nurse, an Army nurse that worked at the Roswell Army Airfield, that she was involved in the preliminary examination of some terribly mutilated alien bodies. Well, his story there is nothing to back it up. It's strictly his own personal story with no supporting witnesses. So you have to go on his credibility to start with. But one of the things that he claimed is that shortly after the nurses, having told him about this incident and giving him sketches of the aliens that were supposedly involved, she supposedly was precipitously transferred from the base and disappeared. And then he later learned, he said, that she had died in a plane crash in England. Well, he gave me the nurse's name, he said. Naomi Maria Self with 2 F's. And this was the first time we had met. And I asked him, well, why, did you give me this information? Because you've not, this is different than what you've told other people. He said, well, I'm not sure that these other guys really know what they're doing, and you got your connections, and maybe you can dig this out. Well, to make a long story short, a lot of us made major efforts to locate this nurse or some record of her. And not only were we unable to locate her, we were able, others, Victor Golubik among others, and myself and Kevin Randle, were able to locate the records of all of the medical personnel who had been assigned to Roswell Army Airfield during the period in question. In fact, years starting in 1946 and all the way through the end of 1948, there was no Naomi Maria Self or anyone with a similar name, and so on. And when confronted with this, Dennis said, oh, well, that wasn't her name anyway, I didn't trust any of you guys, and I'm just never going to reveal what her name really is, and so on. Most interesting, though, about Glenn, and this brings Stan Friedman into the picture big time. In August of 1989, when Stan was in Roswell working on the Unsolved Mysteries segment about the Roswell case, he was taken out to, he learned of Glenn Dennis, and he was taken out to Lincoln by Robert Shirky, another one of the witnesses, to interview him. And in the course of the interview, Glenn says something about, well, I saw some place where the little bodies were found a couple of miles away from where the crash site was. And Stan says, well, was that from the information that I sent to you, or was that somewhere else? He says, well, I saw it being talked about on TV last night, where they had the pictures, and Stan says, oh, well, this, and he shows him a slide of the sketches of the aliens, and Glenn says, oh, yeah, that's it. Well, the sketches of the aliens in question appeared in the Roswell Daily Record on the front page in June of 1987, along with an article in which Stan Friedman is quoted as saying, I have seen government documents that showed that the bodies were found at a site 2.5 to 3 miles away from the debris field. Well, these were the MJ-12 documents, the infamous MJ-12 documents. Well, Glenn, apparently the day that appeared, said something to someone else about having seen those sketches in the paper and said, well, that's what they really look like, by golly. Okay, so Glenn gets the idea from something that Stan had said 2 years before, feeds it back to Stan in 1989. It becomes then part of the Roswell lore, and it's never even noticed. I mean, I myself, until I went back and was going through this material to work to complete this book, my new book, I hadn't picked up on that either. But what we had here was a clear case of the witness feeding back to the ufologist's own words, without the ufologist even knowing it. So the case is full of this kind of thing. Frank Kaufman did the same thing. Frank Kaufman is the other fellow who was everywhere. You know, Frank Kaufman was the guy who watched the spacecraft on the radar. Frank Kaufman was the guy that went out to the crash site. Frank Kaufman this, Frank Kaufman that. Kaufman has been the cornerstone of both the original story about the crash site on the Brazel Ranch, or the debris field on the Brazel Ranch, and then the crash site 2 or 3 miles away with the bodies, and then later the story being moved over to the site north of Roswell. You know, he's the guy that originally it was a disc-shaped craft, and now it's a heel-shaped craft, and so on. But he keyed on lots of things that he was picking up in the same way that Glenn Dennis did. So you have this incredible contamination of the witness testimony, in no small part contributed to by the UFO investigators themselves. Stan being an unfortunate, a significant culprit, at least with reference to Glenn Dennis and Frank Kaufman. One of the continuing sort of myths, if you will, or points of lore in Roswell is that there were hundreds of witnesses. And in fact, when you start boiling down the witnesses to the ones that really matter, and I use witnesses with quotes around it, quite frankly, because many of the people listed as witnesses were just people who you got directions from. I mean, literally so. The kid at the gas station who told you how to make the right turn to get down to the, to Corona or whatever. When you boil this down, you've got only 41 people who legitimately can be considered to be first or second-hand witnesses to something relevant to the case at the time. All right? When you still boil the thing down still further to try to figure out who actually credibly could be considered to have actually seen something of the physical material that was recovered, you get down to 23. When you take it down still further to those who saw the stuff and are claiming odd properties associated with it that suggest otherworldly origins, the number is down to 7. And actually, you can really say 6, because one of those was Colonel Blanchard, who was the commander of the base, who authorized the release of the press announcement that brought the whole case to the world's attention. In his case, you can't really say he thought there were odd properties. He just thought he had a flying saucer. So you've got a half a dozen people The two Marcells, Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer, and his son, Dr. Jesse Marcel, who was 11 at the time, and Loretta Proctor and her husband and a couple of others. And if you look at everything that they have to say, their comments about odd properties are embedded in a much larger body of testimony that points directly to an earthly mundane source, which was this classified project, codenamed Mogul, that was going on about 100 miles away. So you don't really have hundreds of witnesses at all. You've got this tiny handful of people. When you get to the more exotic part of the story, which is the bodies, there are only 4 people who have been interviewed by investigators and who have been identified publicly, who claim to have had direct, first-hand experience with the bodies. One of them is Frank Kaufman, the late Frank Kaufman, who is not credible. There's a tremendous amount of information available on him, and my book's got an entire chapter devoted to him that points that out. There's Jim Ragsdale, who told tall tales, and nobody seems to agree, or everyone seems to agree, regardless of where they are on this case, that he's not credible. You have Gerald Anderson, who, once again, is a highly non-credible witness. And the fourth one, if I could think of the name. Anyway, sorry about that one. But the point is that you have Albert Lovejoy Duran is the 4th person. So you have Ragsdale, Kaufman, Gerald Anderson, and Albert Lovejoy Duran, who was allegedly an Army officer, now retired, who only appears as a throwaway in a footnote in Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt's second book, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, which I find an interesting title, but in any event, he just appears and goes away. So here what have you got? You've got 4 not credible witnesses. You have another person who was anonymous, whom I, in my book, call New Mexico Jones, who called Kevin Randall anonymously and claimed to have been on the site and seen the bodies and been chased off by the Army and so on. To the most exotic part of the whole story, you have a whole slew of people who claim second and third hand knowledge to this exotic stuff, and that's it, and most of them are not credible. You have a half a dozen people who actually, you can say for sure, really did see the physical stuff and handled it, who claim a certain amount of peculiarity about the stuff, but it's in the context of a discussion or of a testimony that talks about all of the things that match up to Project Mogul. So that's the case. I mean, that's Roswell. And yet here we have this wonderful Roswellian myth. Ufologists and ufology are no more immune to human frailties, maybe even more susceptible to them than anyone else. Once you have committed yourself to a particular theory or a particular set of, in this case, like Roswell, witnesses and documents backing up the case and so on, it's extremely difficult. Once you've not only committed yourself to them, but you've done so publicly, that you have established a reputation on and that you've written about at length, that you've published books about, etc. It's extremely difficult to stand up and say, whoops, I was wrong. It's just not in human nature to so readily say, I was wrong. It's in fact much more likely that what you do then is scramble around. And I don't mean to be disparaging about this, because when I say not scramble around, but what you do is you say, okay, people are raising criticisms. In the ideal world, what you do then is you step back and you say very objectively, well, let's take a look at those criticisms, and let's take a look at what it is that I have been touting and that I have been accepting, and see how they stack up against each other. And if there are problems, then, we'll identify them and we'll say that's life. What usually happens instead, though, is that you rush around trying to find out ways to stop up the holes in the dike and to refute the arguments made by your detractors. Rather than offering up more objective evidence, more additional information that shows that these people are wrong and you're right, in an objective accumulation of information, you instead begin to engage in the kind of thing that goes on in ufology all the time. It's, you know, you keep pounding away on your particular arguments and do your best to ignore or vigorously disparage the character of your detractors. And I just think that's just, it's an unfortunate function of human nature. And in ufology, you don't have the same kind of refereed journals and peer review process that you have in other disciplines where that kind of thing can be sorted out more effectively.